sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. And we also saw that, we'll see it again in chapter 2, but also at the end of verse 13, Naomi says, the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And we talked a little bit about this last week, that there are people back then as well as today that automatically think that if something bad happens to them, or to someone else, it must be because they sinned and God's punishing them for that. And that, of course, is not always the case. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. In the Bible, of course, we have it revealed to us, whether it is or whether it's not, so we can know for sure. But in our day and age, we don't have it revealed to us. But we do know God operates that way sometimes. But just because something bad happens doesn't mean that somebody is suffering because of sin or anything like that. Remember Job. We'll study about him later on. But Job is a prime example of one who suffered immensely, and his three friends thought he had to have sinned. And Job, before the suffering happened to him, he would have thought somebody in his situation would have had to sin. But he knows he didn't do anything to sin like that. And so the book unfolds like that. But, it's interesting to say that she went back to her people and to her gods. And when you think about nations in antiquity, in this time anyway, a nation was identified with its God, with its people and so forth. And, you'd have thought, well, we don't know anything about Orpah after she leaves here. But anyway, she did return to her people. Yeah, in other words, when it says she returned to her people and to her gods, doesn't always necessarily mean she's going back into paganism, though it may. But her people and her gods are kind of like her nation and her flag, or her, these are her people. That's how they identified with themselves. All right? But look at verse 16, and we have her pledge here. We actually have a plea, entreat me not to leave thee. And, that should have been gone there. But anyway, there's a symmetrical structure here. I don't know how well it comes off with the new light bulb. I guess it comes out all right. And you see in the middle there, your people shall be my people and your God my God. That's the focus of the whole thing. And I kind of did it like this as well. Entreat me not to leave you kind of parallels sort of with the Lord. Do so to me. In other words, she is begging, she is pleading with her mother-in-law, quit asking me to leave. Quit asking me, entreating me to turn back from following after you. Now again, at this point, Orpah has already gone back, but that kind of parallels here with the Lord, do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. And so in other words, she doesn't want to turn back, and she makes this statement here. This is kind of like some of those psalms, call down curses upon others. Well, this is a self-imprecation, they call it, where she calls down a curse upon herself. If I depart from you, if anything but death parts me and you. And then these two are parallel in a sense here. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. And then where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. And I forget the name of parallels this is, but one is kind of an expansion of the other line. But again, the whole focus is right there. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. And that's the whole focus of that right there. And that's what that's what the whole thing is all about. And again, this was very significant in ancient times. And it helps, studying this helps me appreciate Abraham's obedience even more so. In our day and age, when my kids turn 18, the first thing I want to do is leave. I'm moving out, when I'm 18, And we were kind of like that, I'm sure. We were of age, we wanted to leave, be on our own, and that's all right. But in this culture, they didn't do that, okay? In this culture, they stayed with their people. They stayed with their families. Now, the women would get married, and they would go off to their husbands' families and so forth. But, they were very family-oriented. They stayed together. And so when Abraham was told to leave your country and your kinsmen and so forth, that was very significant. And for Ruth to do the same is very significant. She has no biological connection with Naomi. Though she is still, she still refers to her, her mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship. But most people would have gone back to their families, to their kindred, like Orpah did. But she doesn't do that. She stays along right there. All right, and so Ruth pledges to stay with Naomi. First was a plea, do not entreat me to depart from you. And of course, we looked at that. Now, notice there's a fivefold declaration of commitment, a fivefold declaration of commitment. For wherever you go, I will go. All right? And also, by the way, let me back up on this too. Many times you hear this at weddings. Well, I don't know about many times. I don't know I ever have, but maybe, I don't know. I don't know if I have or not. I know I never have when I did a wedding. And but anyway, I do like weddings. I love weddings. But to go to them and attend them and do them as well. But anyway, yeah, no one gets a better seat in the house than the preacher, man. I'm telling you, that's good. But anyway, wherever you go, I will go. And of course, this is not really a marriage. It's not a husband-wife commitment, but this is more of a commitment toward a daughter-in-law, toward a mother-in-law. But there are some principles that we can use for marriages and a lot of other things for that matter. But wherever you go, I will go. In other words, she is saying that she wants to be with her from now on. Okay? And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. And resting place and so forth. And kind of, if you go back up to chapter 1, where, Naomi wanted for her daughters in verse 9, the Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Well, that finding rest, and that's similar to the word lodge here in the original language. And so, in other words, what Naomi wanted Ruth to do to go find rest, and we talked about that last week, it meant to kind of settle down, have a good marriage and all that. Ruth wants to do with Naomi, to find rest or lodge, wherever you lodge. And then your people will be my people. And again, that's very significant because again, in that culture, to change families, to change cultures and so forth. That's showing definite commitment. And of course, sometimes commentators and stuff will separate these two. Sometimes they'll keep them together. But your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And again, cultures, even in the book of prophets, and in the prophets, and in the Kings and Chronicles, nations had their gods, and their success or failures in battle, they would attribute it to their gods. But there is no other God but Jehovah, or the Lord, or Yahweh. And Naomi's people are God's people. And Naomi's God is the only true and living God. And so there is, there is a sense in which that's a no-brainer from our perspective because, giving up idolatry and all that, which doesn't really exist. But that is very significant for her to give that up and to go with Naomi. And, because, here's, we'll get into this, I guess, a little bit more later, but here are two widows now, okay? Naomi and Ruth, and they were among the most vulnerable in society. Widows and orphans had basically nothing, and so they were very vulnerable. But even in that vulnerability, Ruth is sticking to Naomi and to her people and to her God. And again, it's very significant of Ruth. And then where you die, I will die and be buried where you are. And that, we might say, is sure enough wanting to be part of the family. And of course, in this day and age, families were buried in the same tomb. They put the one in, and we've talked about this in the resurrection. That's why it's so significant that Jesus was laid to rest in a tomb that no man had known, had never been used before. It's brand new, because that way they could know for sure if it was empty, it was empty. But what they would do many times, and you'll hear the expression in the Old Testament quite a bit. I don't think she uses it here, but go to lie with their fathers, and talking about the grave there. But here she says, if anything but death, your people, and there I will be buried. Okay, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. But to be included, to want to be buried in the family cemetery, the family tomb, was very significant. That meant, she wanted to be part of that family. No bones about it, no pun intended, but really significant there. A few people got that, right? Okay. All right. Any questions or comments about that? And then finally at the bottom there, a final oath, the Lord do so to me. Now again, that oath there, the Lord do so to me, that is a calling down. And of course in the translations, Yeah, the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts. And, that's again, she's calling down that the Lord take care of me. Let's see. And literally it says, thus may Yahweh do, or Jehovah do. And again, it stood, in the commentaries and so forth, it stood for long. I have a note here, widely acknowledged series of disasters, death, plague, fire, famine, sword, etc., that Jehovah would inflict on any or all who would renege on their commitments to God. And that's from a commentator there. But behind this statement is, if in other words, she's making an oath here that I will go with you and do all these things. If not, may the Lord do as He wills to me. In other words, she is committing it and calling upon the Lord here to make sure she keeps that, or else the curses will come upon her. Okay, and again, the whole thing is just showing deep commitment to Naomi and to where she goes, to her people and her God. Really great commitment, and we don't see commitment like that a lot, especially among people like that. That are, again, there's no blood relation between them. But yet there's that commitment to, and as we entitled this, kind of subtitled it, an account of fidelity, faith, and family. And so she's really sticking to that. All right, any observations or questions or comments through 18? All right, look at right over here. All right, now verse 19 through 20, Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem. Look in verse 19 through 22. Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem, and it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them, and the women said, is this Naomi? But she said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Okay? And so, here she comes to her, and let me get my thing squared away here. All right? And verse 19, the two of them went. We have the word the two of them went. And then in verse 20, now they came to Bethlehem. And I don't have my map. My map is way too many slides back there. But Moab to Bethlehem was quite a journey. And what were travel conditions like in those days? Yeah, very rough. Not just the terrain, not just the weather, but what else often lurked on the roadways? Yeah, robbers and thieves and all that. And, can you imagine traveling? There's places like that still in the world, not so much in America. I know 471 back in the day, they tell me now, it was before my time when it was a dirt road. I don't even remember it being a dirt road, but they say that a lot of people would hide out there and, put roadblocks up and rob people and all that stuff. I don't know if that's true or not, but BC Carr told me that back in the day, so always when you go through there, just go straight on and don't stop for anything, okay, he said. But anyway, what's that? Yeah. And I don't know, do you any good to have I don't know if you can get a cell phone out there. I guess you can, every year it gets a little bit better through there. But anyway, the roads in this time were like that as well. And there was no radios, no advanced calls, no GPSs to warn you of things, no state troopers. So it was very treacherous, very dangerous. And this is just one of the aspects of the providence of God. Now, we don't know how long it took them to make that journey. We do know that they were in Moab at least 10 years, because after the daughters married the sons of Naomi, it says that they were there 10 years. And so, it doesn't give us a time element here, but we do know that it would take a long time, a lot of danger, a lot of treachery, but yet God watched over them as they came back. Also of note in verse 19 that all the city was excited. That word excited literally comes from a word that means was stirred. And in the original language, it's well, it's what they call an onomatopoeia, which means it sounds like our word gurgle or wisp or something like that is one of those words. And it literally was like it hummed. The whole city hummed, was stirred because of them. All right? Now, when they went back to Bethlehem, of course it does tell us down at the end, they went back to Bethlehem in verse 22. And again, in that culture, clans, families, places didn't change a whole lot. Family members were added, kind of like villages. When we go to Ghana, West Africa, if we go back to the same village, if it's out in the bush, down in the big cities with all the flux of traffic and all that, it's different. But out in the bush, when you go to a town or a village, it's pretty much the same as it was the year, 2 years, 3 years before. Maybe there's more babies on the scene. Maybe the older people have died off, or maybe someone else has gone off to the big city or something. But for the most part, it's the same. And so when you go back in 10 years, there's still a lot of people that would know you. You're still going back to family. You're still going back to close friends and all that, part of the clan, if you will. And so this time when they came back, the city was abuzz at their arrival. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" Now, why do you suppose they would say, "Is this Naomi?" Why would they have to ask that question? Yeah, she'd been gone 10 years, at least 10 years, maybe more, because it doesn't say how long she was before her daughters married. But after they married, they were there 10 years. And so, she'd been gone a lot. And she was what? She was in mourning, yeah. And maybe not in mourning formally, technically, but she had been through a lot. Because her husband died, her sons died. She just traveled this long road. Yeah, she would have. Yeah, her appearance. Yeah. And again, her appearance could be because of the mourning, the travel. She left because of a famine, and so she'd been gone. And so there's something about her that they're like, "Is this Naomi?" And some translations, I didn't get a chance to compare them all here, but some of them may even have this not as a question, but as an exclamation point. "This is Naomi," that type of thing, which, the language would allow for. But again, there's something about her appearance, something about either her appearance or her rival, something about that gets the people all excited, a buzz, humming or whatever. But again, I think it's got to do with the years of life, the years that she's had, the trouble, the struggle she's been through. And also, as she said before, she has this idea that God is against her. The end of chapter 1, verse 13. And then also in chapter 2, just to jump ahead of ourselves, I don't know if I got that marked out here, but we'll get to that. But she does think that God has taken, punished her, if you will, for that. So she's kind of sore at God in all of this. And so that attitude may reflect itself physically, as we know it sometimes does. All right, but whatever the case, she is, the town takes note of that. All right, then notice in verse 20, "Don't call me Naomi." Now Naomi, I think we talked about this last week. What does that name mean, Naomi? Yeah, it means pleasant. And the word Mara means bitter. Okay, so why call me pleasant? Call me bitter. Oh, here it is in verse 20. "For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." And that word Almighty is Shaddai. And so we've seen her use Jehovah back in 1:17 with that pledge there. And she's used Elohim. And so she's used all three of the names of God here. But the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. And Job even thought that same thing. If you look in Job chapter 27, Job chapter 27 and verse 2, Job felt the same thing there. Job 27:2, somebody gets there before me, read. But I got it right here. "As God lives," well, actually verse 1, "Moreover, Job continued his discourse and said, As God lives, who has taken away my justice, and the Almighty who has made my soul bitter." And so he had that same feeling that God had done him wrong. And so, that we'll see that kind of throughout the rest of this as well. but that's her attitude there. Okay, and so she doesn't want to be called Naomi, which means pleasant, but she'd rather be called bitter. All right, then verse 21, I went out full. All right, now in what way did she go out full? Exactly right, yeah. I don't think she's talking so much about food, okay? Because there was a famine when she went out, so we know it wasn't food. But she had a full life. She had everything going, a husband, 2 sons, and she goes out there. But notice the Lord has brought me home again empty. And again, the empty is not the food, but it's more like no husband, no sons, and no daughter. One of the daughters-in-law have already gone back. Why do you call me Naomi again? Since the Lord has testified against me. All right, that word testified, witnessed against me. And again, she's still thinking that her struggles are because God is against her. And so why has the Lord testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? And there again, the Almighty has afflicted me. Now again, as we said before, there is at times, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 28, there are times when God does afflict His people, or at least back then did afflict His people when they sin. In Deuteronomy 28 verses 1 and 2, He says, Now it shall come to pass, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all His commandments which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Then He starts talking about blessed be, blessed shall you be, etc. Talks about all these blessings. Then if you go down to verse 15, But it shall come to pass, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all His commandments and statutes which I command you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. And then he talks about cursed shall you be in the city, etc. And Bob mentioned one of these passages last Sunday morning about eating their own young and so forth. I read that on my phone while I was waiting at a doctor's office one time. But anyway, but all these curses, and all the curses go all the way down through the chapter. The last verse in that chapter, 68, And the Lord will take you back to Egypt in ships, by the way of which I said to you, you shall never see it again, and there you shall be offered for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. And so that whole chapter, the first 14 verses are the blessings, and the next, I'm not good at math, but from verse 15 to 68, all those are curses. So there's probably 3 times more curses there than there are blessings. But again, God is warning them that they need to follow Him. And we would do well to take heed to that warning as well. All right, also if you notice in Job chapter 11, Job chapter 11, beginning in verse 13. And this is Zophar. If you look at chapter 11, verse 1, then Zophar the Naamathite answered and said. And in this section of Job, you have cycles of speeches. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Like the one will make a speech, Job will answer. The other one will make a speech, Job will answer. And you have 3 cycles of that, of all 3 of them speaking. And this is Zophar's response to one of Job's statements. But he says there in verse 13, If you would prepare your heart and stretch out your hands toward Him, if iniquity were in your hand, and you should put it far away, and would not let wickedness dwell in your tents, then surely you could lift your face without spot. Yes, you could be steadfast and not fear, because you would forget your misery and remember it as waters that have passed away. And your life would be brighter than noonday. Though you were dark, you would be like the morning. And you would be secure because there is hope. Yes, you would dig around you and take you rest in safety. And you would also lie down, and no one would make you afraid. Yes, many would court your favor, but the eyes of the wicked will fail or fall, and they shall not escape, and their hope loss of life. And what Zophar is doing here, as all the 3 friends are, they're trying to get Job to repent of this perceived sin that he's committed that he's suffering in such a way. But again, the language, and again, we'll talk about this more so in Job, but what the friends say is true, but it just doesn't apply to Job. And they're trying to justify God at Job's expense, and Job is trying to justify God at, justify himself at God's expense. But we'll get more into the details of that unfolding here in a month or so. All right? But there is a sense in which, God, we reap what we sow in this life, for sure in the life to come. But we do have a lot of Old Testament examples, and even some in the New Testament that do show this in the physical here and now. Like when you think about Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, the earth opened up and swallowed them. They rebelled. Even when Aaron and Miriam rebelled against Moses in Numbers 13, there was some immediate punishment there. In the New Testament, we have Ananias and Sapphira that lied to God, and they were struck dead. And so God did this, and thankfully He doesn't do that today, because probably none of us would be sitting in here if that was the case, But He is merciful and so forth, but He did that and left us examples to show the seriousness of how important it is to follow Him. All right, and then verse 22, Naomi returned along with Ruth, and they returned from the country. And again, there's a whole lot of providence of God in that word returned, because they did travel a long way, very dangerous, very treacherous. Okay? All right, any questions on chapter 1? All right, look at chapter 2 of Ruth, chapter 2 here. Ruth's gleaning in the fields of Boaz. And notice in chapter 2, verse 1, now there was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. Okay, and remember, as I said before, when they came back to their village, those villages were mainly comprised of families, clans, and so forth. And so there's this man named Boaz. Notice it says 3 things about him. He's a relative of Naomi's husband. He's a man of great wealth, and he is from the family of Elimelech, and that was her husband. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." And then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. All right? And so here she is there in the land there, and she wants to glean. Now, what does that tell you about her work ethic? Did Ruth have a good work ethic? Yeah, absolutely. Here she is, a widow, but yet she wanted to go to the field and glean heads of grain. And we'll just mention it here, but remember in the Old Testament, if you just notice with me in Leviticus 19, for example, Leviticus 19, there were, in the law of Moses, there were provisions for the poor, for the homeless and the widows and so forth, to be able to survive and live off the land. Notice in Leviticus 9, verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. And also, if you notice in chapter 23, verse 22, Leviticus 23, 22, again, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field. When you reap, nor shall you gather any gleanings from your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. And then also in Deuteronomy 24:19, Deuteronomy 24:19, and this is this whole chapter of Deuteronomy 24 has to do with taking care of the most vulnerable in society. But in Deuteronomy 24 and verse 19, 24:19, wrong chapter here. All right, if somebody gets there before me, you can read. But I'm right here. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf of the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. And so there it explicitly mentions the fatherless and the widow, that they may have a way to survive. And so you had the law of gleaning there, and this was in Judah, and Boaz followed that same thing. All right, and then verse 4, in chapter 2 and verse 4, now behold, Boaz came. Get this up here. Boaz notices Ruth. So Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers. All right, now notice what Boaz says to the reapers. The Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. And that's the word Jehovah there. All right, what does that tell us about Boaz right off the bat? He says, the Lord be with you. Yeah, he's religious, and the right religious, okay? Because he's Jehovah, the Lord be with you. And they answered him, the Lord bless you. And so there was a relationship like that. And does anybody remember what Paul said about servants and masters relationship? Back, for example, look at Ephesians chapter... Well, let's look at Colossians. I like Colossians. I think it's a little bit briefer. Look at Colossians chapter 3 in the New Testament, Colossians chapter 3. And let me find the verse here. Yeah, verse 22. Colossians 3:22, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever you do, do it heartily to the Lord and not unto men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. But he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, give your bondservants that which is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Continue earnestly in prayer, etc. Okay? But you know, if masters treated their slaves the way as Christian brothers and sisters, and if slaves reacted to their masters in the physical, worldly sense, as Christian brothers and sisters, and slavery would be no need. And eventually, kind of what happened after a couple wars and all that stuff, but not just in America, worldwide. And so, you know, and we often make the application, I think rightly so, to employers and employees. But here's a man here who, you know, greets his workers, reapers, with Jehovah be with you, or Lord be with you, and they reciprocate that back to him. So that tells us he's a good guy. Then Boaz said to the servant who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? Okay? Because again, Ruth was not from there. And so when Naomi goes back to her people, that doesn't mean that they're going to recognize Ruth. So who's this woman here? So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, it is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from Moab, from the country of Moab. And she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she rested a little while, or a little in the house. And the house there would have been a resting place where they would take a break. But notice, please let me glean. And so he is saying this is how she got here. And again, I think that shows work ethic from Ruth. And I don't know if they had all that back in those day and age, but she didn't want to, you know, get assistance from the government or whatever. And I don't know how much of that they had back in that day and age, but she was willing to go to work, even if it meant an unconventional employment for a woman in that day and age. And that is to go behind those who were gleaning. Okay? And then verse 8, Boaz provides for Ruth. Then Boaz said to Ruth, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. All right, he is very courteous to her. And again, Boaz here is impressed with her. Now, you know, mainly, at least what God reveals to us through the book here, he's impressed mainly, I think, because of her work ethic. But, you know, he may see some attraction to her as well, who knows. But in other words, she stood out. And we'll put it like that. She stood out, which when you look at those Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, that's how we should do. We should stand out. Okay, we should stand out. And sometimes that stands out for good. We influence like salt and light. Sometimes it stands out for persecution. Those that oppose God will come after us. But Boaz is a good man, and Ruth stands out in a good way. And so he starts helping her out here. Verse 9, let your eyes be on the field. Actually, before that, stay close to my young women. In other words, stick with his women. All right? And, his family. So he's kind of taking her in under his wing. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have not I commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. So she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? And Boaz answered and said to her, it has been fully reported to me. Well, we'll have to pick up with verse 11 right there. But he's going to go on, and he knows a lot about her, and again, good character stands out. And we see that with Joseph. We see that with Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we see that in the New Testament with Peter and Paul and others. And so, this sounds kind of tacky, but it pays to serve God. And we shouldn't, of course, do it just for the physical blessings, but things will happen, doors will open for us if we follow God and stick close to Him. All right? Appreciate your attention.